March 1947. The corner of 135th Street and 8th Avenue in Harlem was a commercial intersection where several small businesses operated: a barber shop, a pharmacy, a restaurant, a grocery store, a tailor shop. On weekday mornings in early spring, the area was moderately busy, with residents conducting daily business before heading to work, shop owners opening their establishments and preparing for the day's trade, delivery trucks unloading supplies at various locations. The atmosphere carried the rhythms of a working neighborhood where economic activity sustained families and where small business owners navigated the challenges of operating in a community with limited capital and constant pressure from various outside interests seeking to extract profit. At 9:30 on this particular Tuesday morning in mid-March, Samuel Washington stood inside his tailor shop at 247 West 135th Street, preparing to open for business. Samuel was 46 years old, a black man who had operated the tailor shop for 8 years since 1939, building a steady clientele among Harlem residents who needed clothing altered or repaired. His shop occupied a narrow storefront with one large window facing the street, a work counter near the back where he operated his sewing machine, and racks along the walls where customers' clothing hung waiting for pickup. Samuel dressed carefully each day in pressed trousers, white shirt, and vest, maintaining the professional appearance he believed was necessary to build trust with customers who entrusted him with their best garments. As Samuel unlocked the front door and turned the sign from closed to open, two men approached from the sidewalk and entered the shop without waiting for invitation. The men were white, both in their 30s, wearing suits that suggested Italian heritage and organized crime affiliation. Dark wool, carefully tailored, shoes polished to high shine, fedoras worn at angles that conveyed authority rather than style. Their entrance and their immediate positioning inside the shop, one blocking the door, the other moving to stand between Samuel and the back room, indicated this was not a social visit or a request for tailoring services. The man who had positioned himself between Samuel and the back room introduced himself as Tony Rosselli and identified his companion as Vincent Gallo. Rosselli said they represented business interests that operated in Harlem, and that these interests had observed Samuel's tailor shop was doing well enough to afford protection services. He explained that protection would cost Samuel $35 per week, payable every Monday morning, and that this payment would ensure that Samuel's shop remained safe from vandalism, theft, or other problems that sometimes affected businesses that operated without appropriate protection. The demand was delivered in a tone that was conversational but firm, suggesting this was not a negotiation, but an announcement of terms that Samuel was expected to accept. Rosselli gestured around the shop as he spoke, noting the sewing machines, the racks of clothing, the large front window, at the various elements of Samuel's business that could be damaged if protection was not maintained. The implicit threat was clear without being stated explicitly: pay the protection money or the shop would suffer consequences. Samuel listened to this entire presentation without interrupting, his expression showing neither fear nor anger. When Rosselli finished speaking, Samuel said that he could not afford $35 per week, that his business generated modest profit that supported his family, but that did not leave room for additional expenses of that magnitude, and that he would need time to consider the proposal. Rosselli's response was immediate and dismissive. He said that Samuel's financial limitations were not relevant to the business interests he represented, and that the protection fee was based on the shop's location and potential rather than on Samuel's current income, and that consideration time was not available because protection services needed to begin immediately to be effective. Rosselli then specified that the first payment of $35 would be due the following Monday morning at 9 o'clock, and that failure to pay would result in consequences that Samuel should avoid by simply accepting the reasonable terms being offered. Throughout this exchange, other people on 135th Street walked past Samuel's shop, some glancing in through the front window and seeing the two white men inside speaking with Samuel. The presence of Italian men in a black-owned business in Harlem, conducting what appeared to be a tense conversation, was noticeable, but no one intervened. And the dynamics of organized crime in the neighborhood meant that most residents understood when situations involved mob business and knew that direct intervention could create problems for themselves without necessarily helping the person being pressured. After delivering the ultimatum about Monday's payment, Rosselli and Gallo departed from the shop, walking west on 135th Street and disappearing around a corner. Samuel stood behind his work counter, processing what had just occurred and beginning to understand the implications for his business and his family. Samuel could comply with the demand and pay $35 per week, which would consume approximately half his weekly profit and would make operating the shop marginally viable at best. Or he could refuse to pay and risk whatever consequences Rosselli and his associates would impose: vandalism, theft, physical intimidation, or worse. He could close the shop and seek other employment, abandoning the business he had built over 8 years and losing the investment he had made in equipment, inventory, and establishing clientele. None of these options was acceptable. Compliance would reduce his family to near poverty despite his working full-time. Refusal would likely result in destruction of the shop or harm to himself. Closing would waste 8 years of effort and would leave him unemployed at age 46 in a labor market that offered limited opportunities for black men with specialized skills like tailoring. Samuel decided that before making any decision, he would seek advice from someone who understood how organized crime operated in Harlem and who might have insights about options that Samuel had not considered. Samuel locked his shop and walked north on 8th Avenue to 145th Street, then east to the apartment building where his friend Marcus lived. Marcus Thompson was a numbers runner who worked for Bumpy Johnson's organization, collecting bets from residents and businesses throughout Harlem and delivering the receipts to central counting locations. Marcus understood the structures and relationships that governed criminal operations in the neighborhood, and Samuel hoped Marcus could provide perspective about the situation with Rosselli and Gallo. Samuel found Marcus at his apartment and explained what had occurred that morning. The two Italian men, the demand for $35 per week, the Monday deadline, the implicit threats. Marcus listened carefully, asked several questions about Rosselli and Gallo's appearance and exact words, then told Samuel to wait while he made a telephone call. Marcus called a number that connected to one of Johnson's business locations and spoke with someone who appeared to be a lieutenant or manager in the organization. Marcus explained that an Italian crew was attempting to extort a black shopkeeper in Johnson's territory, described the details Samuel had provided, and asked whether this represented authorized activity that black business owners should accept or unauthorized freelancing that violated the agreements governing how criminal organizations operated in Harlem. And the person Marcus spoke with said he would investigate and would call back within a few hours. Marcus told Samuel to return to his shop and to operate normally, and that Marcus would contact him later with information about how to proceed. Samuel returned to his tailor shop and attempted to focus on his regular work, measuring a customer for alterations, repairing a torn jacket, pressing trousers for pickup. But his concentration was disrupted by awareness that the Monday deadline was approaching and that he had not yet determined how to respond to Rosselli's demand. Meanwhile, the telephone call Marcus had made initiated a process of information gathering and strategic analysis within Johnson's organization. The lieutenant who had taken Marcus's call reported the situation to Johnson, explaining that Italian operators were attempting to collect protection money from a black tailor on 135th Street, that this appeared to violate the territorial boundaries established through the 1935 agreement between Johnson and Lucky Luciano, and that the situation required investigation to determine whether this represented authorized Italian mob activity or unauthorized freelancing by individual operators. Johnson recognized immediately that the situation with Samuel Washington's tailor shop was significant not because of the specific $35 involved, but because it represented a potential challenge to the entire framework that governed criminal operations in Harlem. The 1935 agreement with Luciano had established that black operators would maintain independence over numbers rackets in exchange for sharing profits with the Italian mob. This agreement had been expanded informally over subsequent years to include understanding that black-owned legitimate businesses in Harlem would not be subject to Italian mob protection rackets, since such extortion would undermine the economic foundation of the community from which the numbers operations derived their revenue. If Italian operators were now attempting to extort black shopkeepers, it meant either that the Italian mob leadership had decided to expand their activities in ways that violated the informal understandings, or that individual Italian operators were freelancing without authorization in ways that could destabilize the entire relationship between black and Italian criminal organizations. Johnson needed to determine which situation applied before deciding how to respond. If the extortion represented official Italian mob policy, Johnson would need to negotiate or resist at an organizational level. If it represented unauthorized freelancing, Johnson could address it by demonstrating to Italian mob leadership that such activity violated their interests and should be stopped. Over the next 48 hours, Johnson had associates gather information about Tony Rosselli and Vincent Gallo, who they worked for, what authorization they had, whether their attempted extortion of Samuel Washington represented isolated freelancing or part of a broader pattern. The investigation revealed several important facts. Rosselli and Gallo were low-level associates of the Genovese crime family who operated primarily in the Bronx, collecting protection money from businesses and conducting enforcement for loan sharking operations. They had no established presence in Harlem and had no apparent authorization from Genovese family leadership to operate in that territory. Their attempt to extort Samuel Washington appeared to be an opportunistic freelance operation, rather than part of an organized expansion into Harlem. Further investigation revealed that Rosselli and Gallo had approached approximately 6 other black-owned businesses in Harlem over the previous 2 weeks, and making similar demands for protection payments. 3 of these business owners had paid the initial weekly fee out of fear, Two had refused and were considering whether to close their businesses to avoid consequences, and one had contacted the police, but had been told that protection rackets were difficult to prosecute without witnesses willing to testify. This information clarified that Rosselli and Gallo were conducting an unauthorized operation that was already affecting multiple black businesses in Johnson's territory. The situation required a response that would stop the extortion, protect the businesses that were being targeted, and establish precedent that would prevent similar unauthorized operations in the future. Johnson recognized that his response needed to accomplish several objectives simultaneously: stop Rosselli and Gallo's extortion of black businesses, demonstrate to Genevieve's family leadership that such unauthorized operations violated their interests and should be prevented, establish compensation for the businesses that had already paid protection money, and create systemic changes that would make similar unauthorized operations less likely in the future. To develop a strategy that would achieve these objectives, Johnson began building a coalition of people who could provide different forms of pressure and support that would be necessary to address the extortion systematically. The first ally Johnson recruited was Thomas Bradley, an attorney who handled legal matters for Johnson's organization and who had connections throughout New York's legal and criminal networks. Bradley's role would be to communicate with attorneys who represented Genevieve's family interests, explaining that Rosselli and Gallo's activities were creating problems that could attract law enforcement attention to Italian mob operations in ways that served no one's interests. Bradley would also prepare documentation of the extortion attempts: dates, amounts demanded, names of businesses affected, that could be used as evidence if the situation required more formal intervention. The second ally was Reverend Thomas Henderson of Abyssinian Baptist Church, a respected community leader who had influence with both Harlem residents and with political figures in New York City. Henderson's role would be to organize a public meeting where black business owners could discuss the protection racket problem, creating community pressure that would make the extortion politically visible and would make it difficult for Italian mob leadership to ignore the situation. The third ally was Meyer Lansky, the Jewish organized crime figure who had worked with both Johnson and the Italian mob families and who valued stable business relationships over short-term profit extraction. Lansky had extensive connections throughout organized crime and had influence with Genovese family leadership through various joint ventures in gambling operations. Johnson met with Lansky and explained that Rosselli and Gallo's freelance extortion was destabilizing Harlem business conditions in ways that threatened the numbers operations that generated revenue for both black and Italian organizations. Lansky agreed to communicate to Genovese leadership that stopping the unauthorized extortion served their interests. The fourth ally was Stephanie St. Clair, who had run Harlem's numbers operations before Johnson took over in the 1930s, and who maintained influence in the community through her reputation and her relationships with various business owners. St. Clair's role would be to mobilize black business owners to resist the extortion collectively rather than each negotiating individually, creating strength through organization that would make the extortion more difficult to sustain. With this coalition assembled, Johnson developed a specific strategy for addressing Rosselli and Gallo's extortion in ways that would achieve his multiple objectives. The strategy had several components that would unfold over approximately 2 weeks. The first component involved documenting the extortion comprehensively. Thomas Bradley interviewed the 6 business owners who had been approached by Rosselli and Gallo, recording the dates of each contact, the amounts demanded, the threats made, and the payments that had been collected. This documentation created a record that demonstrated pattern and intent, showing that Rosselli and Gallo were conducting systematic extortion rather than isolated incidents. Bradley also had each business owner sign affidavits describing what had occurred, creating legal documentation that could be provided to law enforcement if necessary. The existence of these affidavits gave Johnson leverage even without actually involving police. The threat of legal documentation being shared with authorities created pressure that could be useful in negotiations. The second component involved organizing community resistance. Reverend Henderson convened a meeting at Abyssinian Baptist Church on the Sunday following the initial extortion attempt against Samuel Washington. Approximately 40 black business owners attended this meeting, along with community leaders, church members, and political representatives. And Henderson explained that multiple businesses were being extorted by Italian operators who had no authorization to operate in Harlem and whose activities violated the agreements that had kept criminal conflicts from disrupting legitimate commerce in the neighborhood. The meeting established a mutual support network among business owners. If Rosselli and Gallo approached any business for payment, that owner would refuse and would immediately contact other network members who would gather at the location to witness and document the interaction. This collective resistance strategy meant that Rosselli and Gallo could no longer isolate individual business owners and pressure them privately. Any extortion attempt would occur in front of multiple witnesses who could document what happened. And the third component involved having Meyer Lansky communicate with Genovese family leadership about what Rosselli and Gallo were doing. Lansky met with senior figures in the Genovese organization and explained that 2 of their low-level associates were conducting unauthorized extortion in Harlem, that this was creating community organizing and law enforcement attention that threatened Italian mob interests, that the activity violated the territorial understandings that had kept Harlem stable and profitable for both black and Italian organizations, and that Lansky's various joint ventures with the Genovese family would be affected if the situation escalated into conflict. Lansky's message was not a threat, but was a business argument. Rosselli and Gallo were creating problems that generated no meaningful revenue for the Genovese family while creating risks that threatened much larger operations. Stopping them served the family's interests better than allowing their freelance activity to continue. The fourth component involved Johnson sending a direct message to Rosselli and Gallo that their activity in Harlem was known, documented, and opposed. Johnson had 2 of his associates approach Rosselli and Gallo at a location in the Bronx, where they conducted their regular business, delivering a verbal message that their extortion attempts in Harlem had been observed and reported to multiple parties, including community organizations, legal representatives, and their own organizational leadership. And the message specified that no further extortion attempts should occur, and that payments that had already been collected should be returned to the businesses that had paid them. This message was delivered in a tone that was informational rather than threatening. Johnson's representatives simply stated facts about what was known and what should happen next, without making explicit threats about consequences for non-compliance. The restraint of the message was itself significant, suggesting that Johnson had capacity for more aggressive responses, but was choosing to resolve the situation through communication and organizational channels. These various forms of pressure converged over approximately 10 days following the initial extortion of Samuel Washington. The pressure came from multiple directions simultaneously. Community organizing through Reverend Henderson's network, legal documentation through Thomas Bradley's affidavits, business arguments through Meyer Lansky's communications with Genovese leadership, direct communication through Johnson's message to Rosselli and Gallo. The resolution began when Genovese family leadership summoned Rosselli and Gallo to a meeting and informed them that their activities in Harlem were unauthorized, that they had created problems with community organizations and with other criminal operators who had agreements with the Genovese family, and that they needed to immediately cease all activity in Harlem and needed to address the problems they had created. Genovese leadership then communicated to Johnson through intermediaries that Rosselli and Gallo had been operating without authorization, that the family had no interest in disrupting the stable arrangements that governed Harlem, and that the situation would be corrected. The communication included an offer. Rosselli and Gallo would be required to return all money they had collected from Harlem businesses and would be required to apologize publicly to the businesses they had attempted to extort, demonstrating that their activity had been unauthorized and would not be tolerated. Johnson accepted this resolution, but added one additional requirement. In addition to returning the money that had been collected, Rosselli and Gallo would pay an additional $50 to each business they had approached, compensating those businesses for the disruption and stress their extortion attempts had created. This compensation would total $300 for the 6 businesses and would establish precedent that unauthorized extortion attempts created financial costs for the people who conducted them. Genovese leadership agreed to this additional requirement, recognizing that the compensation was modest relative to the larger interests at stake, and that agreeing to Johnson's terms demonstrated respect for the territorial arrangements that both organizations benefited from maintaining. On Monday morning, March 31st, 1947, 2 weeks after the initial extortion attempt against Samuel Washington, Tony Rosselli and Vincent Gallo appeared at Samuel's tailor shop, accompanied by a representative from the Genovese family. The representative introduced himself as Michael Costello, identified himself as speaking for Genovese family interests, and stated that Rosselli and Gallo had been operating without authorization when they attempted to collect protection money from Samuel Washington and other Harlem businesses. Rosselli then stated that he apologized for the unauthorized extortion attempt, that it did not represent Genovese family policy, and that it would not occur again. He handed Samuel an envelope containing $85, the $35 that was the original weekly payment demand, plus $50 additional as compensation for the disruption. This scene was repeated at each of the 6 businesses that Rosselli and Gallo had approached over the previous 2 weeks. At each location, Michael Costello introduced the situation, and Rosselli apologized, and payment was made, returning any money that had been collected, plus the $50 compensation. At the final business, a barbershop on 137th Street, Reverend Henderson and approximately 20 members of the business owner Mutual Support Network were present to witness the apology and payment. Their presence transformed what could have been a private resolution into a public demonstration that collective organization had achieved protection that individual business owners could not have achieved alone. The immediate outcome was that the 6 businesses received their money back, plus compensation. Rosselli and Gallo were barred from operating in Harlem, and the extortion attempt ended without any of the businesses suffering vandalism or other retaliation. But the longer-term outcomes were more significant because they changed how black business owners understood their relationship to organized crime in Harlem and how Italian mob families understood the costs of allowing unauthorized operations in territories governed by established arrangements. For the black business owners who had been targeted by Rosselli and Gallo, the resolution demonstrated that collective organization and appeals to appropriate authorities, in this case, to Johnson's organization and to Genevieve's family leadership, could provide protection more effectively than individual attempts to negotiate or resist. The mutual support network that Reverend Henderson had organized during the crisis continued operating after the resolution, creating ongoing capacity for business owners to coordinate responses to future challenges, whether those challenges came from criminal extortion, discriminatory city policies, or economic pressures. For the broader Harlem community, the resolution demonstrated that Johnson's control of the neighborhood included not just management of numbers operations, but also protection of legitimate businesses from outside exploitation. This protective function increased Johnson's standing in the community and created additional legitimacy for his position as the primary power broker in Harlem's economic affairs. For the Genovese crime family, the resolution demonstrated that allowing low-level associates to freelance in territories governed by established agreements created more problems than benefits. Rosselli and Gallo had generated perhaps $200 in extortion payments over 2 weeks. But the disruption they created had required senior leadership attention, had created tension with Meyer-Lansky's joint ventures, had generated community organizing that could attract law enforcement scrutiny, and had required the family to pay $300 in compensation, plus accept the embarrassment of having their associates apologize publicly. The costs far exceeded the benefits, creating incentive for better supervision of associates and clearer enforcement of territorial boundaries. For Meyer-Lansky and other criminal operators who valued stable business relationships, as the resolution demonstrated that the informal agreements governing territorial boundaries in New York's criminal economy could be enforced through coalition pressure and organizational discipline without requiring violence that would attract law enforcement attention. This model of resolution reinforced the value of maintaining stable agreements rather than allowing constant territorial conflicts. The mutual support network that emerged from the crisis continued operating for more than a decade, expanding to include approximately 100 black-owned businesses throughout Harlem by the mid-1950s. The network met monthly to discuss common challenges, shared information about regulatory requirements and business opportunities, and maintained capacity to mobilize collective resistance if businesses were threatened by extortion, discrimination, or other forms of exploitation. Thomas Bradley, the attorney who had documented the extortion and had facilitated communication with Genovese family representatives, became the network's legal advisor, providing guidance about business licensing, contract negotiations, property leases, and other legal matters that affected small business operations. This legal support helped network members navigate bureaucratic challenges that often created obstacles for Black entrepreneurs who lacked connections to legal expertise. Reverend Henderson incorporated support for the business owner network into Abyssinian Baptist Church's community programs, using the church's physical space for meetings and using the church's moral authority to reinforce the principle that Black business owners deserved protection from exploitation. Whether that exploitation came from criminal organizations, from discriminatory government policies, or from predatory business practices by larger firms. The network's existence and its demonstrated capacity to mobilize collective action created deterrent effects that prevented similar extortion attempts in subsequent years. Italian mob associates who might have considered freelance operations in Harlem understood that such operations would trigger organized resistance that would create problems with their own leadership, making the risk-reward calculation unfavorable. Samuel Washington continued operating his tailor shop for another 15 years until his retirement in 1962. The $85 he received from Rosselli, the returned extortion payment plus compensation, represented approximately 2 weeks of profit, a significant amount that helped stabilize his family finances during a period when business had been uncertain. But more valuable than the money was the knowledge that collective organization could provide protection that individual resistance could not achieve, and that appealing to appropriate authorities within the criminal hierarchy could sometimes produce better outcomes than either compliance or confrontation. When Johnson died in July 1968, the obituaries and tributes included references to his role protecting Harlem businesses from outside exploitation. But the story of Rosselli and Gallo's attempted extortion and the resolution that forced them to apologize and pay compensation was told as an example of how Johnson had used strategic organization rather than violence to defend community interests. The story emphasized several lessons that remained relevant long after the specific incident: that collective organization created power that isolated individuals lacked, that appealing to appropriate authorities within established hierarchies could sometimes achieve resolution that direct resistance could not, that documentation and legal preparation created leverage even without involving law enforcement, that coalition building across different stakeholder groups amplified pressure and created multiple channels for influence. Mamie Hatcher Johnson, who had married Johnson in 1948 and who wrote a memoir in 2008, referenced the Business Owner Protection Network as an example of her husband's strategic sophistication. She noted that Johnson understood that his long-term interests aligned with protecting Harlem's legitimate economy, because that economy provided the foundation for the numbers operations that generated his revenue, and because protecting business owners created community support that gave Johnson political capital when he needed it. The model of collective business owner organization that emerged from the 1947 crisis influenced subsequent civil rights era organizing in Harlem. When activists in the 1960s sought to build economic power in Black communities, they referenced the business owner networks that had been established in the 1940s and 1950s as examples of how organization could create leverage that individual action could not achieve. The requirement that Rosselli and Gallo pay compensation, in addition to returning extorted money, became a precedent that Johnson applied in subsequent situations where unauthorized operators created problems in Harlem. The principle was that creating disruption carried costs beyond just ceasing the disruptive activity. There needed to be material compensation for the harm that had been done, establishing that violations of territorial agreements and community norms were expensive rather than just temporarily inconvenient. Thomas Bradley, reflecting years later on the Rosselli-Gallo situation, noted that the resolution demonstrated the importance of understanding organizational hierarchies within criminal operations. Rosselli and Gallo had assumed they could operate in Harlem without consequences because they were affiliated with a powerful crime family. But they had not understood that their own leadership valued stable relationships with Johnson more than they valued protecting low-level associates who created problems through unauthorized freelancing. Bradley emphasized that effective strategy required understanding these organizational dynamics and using them to create pressure through channels that served multiple parties' interests. Meyer Lansky, in conversations with associates over subsequent years, cited the Rosselli-Gallo resolution as an example of how criminal organizations could maintain stability through enforcement of territorial agreements rather than through constant warfare. Lansky noted that the resolution had required minimal violence, just organizational discipline applied through established hierarchies, and had produced an outcome that served everyone's interests except those of the two individuals who had violated the agreements. The business owner mutual support network that emerged from the crisis evolved over time to address challenges beyond just protection from criminal extortion. Network members shared information about sourcing inventory, negotiated collective purchasing agreements to reduce costs, provided mentorship to new business owners entering the network, and advocated collectively for city policies that supported small business development in Harlem. By the late 1950s, the network had formalized into an organization called the Harlem Business Cooperative, with elected leadership, regular meetings, and specific programs addressing various challenges that black business owners faced. The cooperative maintained the mutual support function that had been its original purpose. Members could still call on the network for assistance if they faced extortion or other threats, but had expanded to provide broader support for business development and sustainability. The story of how the network emerged from Samuel Washington's crisis with Rosselli and Gallo became part of the cooperative's founding mythology. It told to new members as an example of why collective organization mattered and how it could achieve protection and advancement that individual action could not provide. When Reverend Henderson died in 1965, his obituary in the Amsterdam News included extensive discussion of his role organizing the business owner network in 1947 and his continued support for the Harlem Business Cooperative over subsequent years. Henderson's family established a scholarship fund in his name that provided business training and startup capital for young black entrepreneurs in Harlem, continuing his legacy of supporting economic development in the community. The principle that Johnson established through the Rosselli-Gallo resolution, that unauthorized exploitation of Harlem businesses would be met with organized resistance that would force apology and compensation, influenced how Italian mob families approached their activities in Harlem for decades afterward. The Genovese family and other Italian organizations maintained their profit-sharing arrangements with Johnson's numbers operations, but they generally avoided attempting to extort legitimate black-owned businesses, recognizing that such extortion violated the informal agreements that made Harlem operations profitable for everyone involved. The compensation that Rosselli and Gallo were required to pay, $50 to each business they had approached, was modest in absolute terms, but significant in precedent. It established that violations carried material costs beyond just ceasing the violating activity, creating deterrent effects that made similar violations less attractive to potential future violators. The public apologies that Rosselli and Gallo were required to make at each business, witnessed by business owners and community members, created reputational consequences that reinforced the material costs. Rosselli and Gallo's standing within their own organization suffered because they had created problems that required senior leadership intervention and had required the organization to pay compensation and accept public embarrassment. This reputational damage made other low-level associates less likely to attempt similar unauthorized operations, understanding that the personal costs could extend beyond just financial penalties. The strategic sophistication that Johnson demonstrated through the Rosselli-Gallo resolution, building coalitions, documenting violations, appealing to organizational hierarchies, creating multiple forms of pressure simultaneously, requiring both apology and compensation, became characteristic of how power was understood to work most effectively in Harlem's criminal economy. Violence remained available as an option when necessary, but strategic organization that mobilized multiple stakeholders and worked through established channels achieved better outcomes more consistently. Decades after the incident, when historians and sociologists studied economic development in black urban communities during the mid-20th century, some referenced the Harlem Business Cooperative and its origins in the 1947 crisis as an example of how collective organization emerged in response to specific threats and then evolved to address broader challenges. The cooperative demonstrated that organizations built for defensive purposes, protecting against extortion, could develop additional functions that served developmental purposes, supporting business growth and sustainability. The story of Samuel Washington's tailor shop and the extortion attempt that triggered broader community organizing became emblematic of a pattern that appeared repeatedly in Harlem's history: individual crises that revealed systemic problems, collective responses that addressed immediate threats while building lasting organizational capacity. A strategic leadership that converted defensive mobilization into developmental infrastructure. The quiet nature of how Johnson orchestrated the resolution, no public confrontation with Rosselli and Gallo, no dramatic violence, just systematic pressure building through multiple channels until organizational discipline was applied through established hierarchies, demonstrated that the most effective exercises of power often occurred through processes that were invisible to outside observers, but that created real and lasting change in how systems operated. The legacy was that collective organization could provide protection that isolated individuals could not achieve, that strategic coalition building could mobilize multiple forms of pressure simultaneously, that working through established organizational hierarchies could produce better outcomes than direct confrontation, and that requiring both apology and compensation for violations created precedent that deterred future violations. These lessons remained relevant long after the specific incident involving Samuel Washington and Tony Rosselli had faded from immediate memory, influencing how Harlem residents approached challenges and opportunities for decades afterward.